University of Queensland, Australia, where she is currently the Director of Research Innovation and Higher Degree Research. So you're the right person, to have in this conference. Her research spans education, psychology, and medical education, and her collaborators are national and international experts in these disciplines. Dr. Edwards has an international reputation for contributing to understanding the link between anxiety, attention, and memory. Her latest work focuses on the translation of theory-driven basic science into treatments for clinical problems, specifically for children and adolescents. Specifically, her research laboratory is conducting a series of studies investigating whether training the cognitive process most vulnerable to anxiety and depression can in turn reduce emotional symptoms in children and adolescents. Her presentation today will take us through some of her findings. Her speech today entitled Childhood Anxiety, Closing the Treatment Gap. Very relatable to all of us. Let's welcome Dr. Liz Edwards. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Azul. I tuned in just at the end there, and wow, this is a real change of pace here. You are having some fabulous guest speakers, and really echo William in saying thank you for giving me the opportunity as well to share some of my insights with you. I'm just going to share my screen so that I have my slides. One sec. Can you just give me a thumbs up there, Azul, if you can see that title slide? Thank you. I'm going to put all those faces over there. All right, thank you, guys. As Azul said, I'm a senior lecturer and I'm actually a registered psychologist here in Australia, and I work in the School of Education. This year, I took on the role as Director of Research and Innovation, so that makes me nervous now that I've got to be innovative myself. But let me entertain you for the next 45 minutes and you can tell me if I'm doing okay with that. Before I go forward, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking from. So here in Australia, I'm on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I would like to acknowledge their contributions to past and future societies. What I'm going to do is walk you through what we know about anxiety, talk about what I mean by the treatment gap, and talk about how we can find innovative solutions to the treatment gap. Talk about a theoretical framework that's informing what I'm calling my innovation, and then walk you through a program of research that I've been working on for the last couple of years and some directions for that future work. And I'd be very interested to hear from you at the end, because obviously I have tried to put an international perspective on this, but a lot of my findings are very much Australian-based. So I'd be very much keen to hear from you as to whether you think this kind of thing would be viable in Indonesian society. So the next slide, as soon as I click, hopefully will be a little video. So you've got to be quick to catch the beginning, and I've got to be quick to try and turn the volume up for you. And it just gives it's me narrating, and it just gives you, 90 seconds worth of what is anxiety, just to kind of set the scene.
We all know what anxiety feels like, and it feels uncomfortable, sometimes even unbearable.
Can you hear that?
Yes. Clear.
All good? Okay.
All good, all good.
Ah. Again.
What anxiety feels like, and it feels uncomfortable, sometimes even unbearable. So we're led to think that anxiety is a bad thing. But anxiety serves an important function, and that is to avoid danger. For example, we're supposed to feel anxious or uneasy when standing on the edge of a cliff to help us feel safe. And we're supposed to feel anxious or a little worried about taking an exam because it motivates us to perform better. Anxiety prepares us for action. On the other hand, disordered anxiety is when the worrisome feelings seem to take over our life. Disordered anxiety makes us fearful and want to avoid certain situations. And the harder we try and make it go away, the stronger it gets. Disordered anxiety is when one of two things happen. First, when we think and feel in danger, when in fact we're safe. And that could be irrational thoughts of danger, like, I'm going to make a fool of myself, or feelings of danger, physical sensations like a racing heart or even panic. And second, when anxiety interferes with our daily functioning. So we might feel sick and start to avoid or refuse to go to school or work.
So one of the reasons I wanted to play that is so that we set the scene in terms of anxiety can be a normal part of daily life. And those feelings that I was narrating there of cognitive and somatic become problematic when they're interfering with our daily life. And that is when, I guess, we're tipping into what we call clinical levels of anxiety, as opposed to just everyday fluctuations of stress and anxiety. So when I talk in this presentation about anxiety, I can be talking at just elevated levels of normal anxiety, but also they could be tipping into clinical levels. So here I'm saying 1 in 5 adults will experience anxiety in their lifetime. That's actually clinical levels of anxiety. And recent findings are actually suggesting that that could be as high as 1 in 3 across the lifespan. And we know that not only does that have a personal impact on somebody's life, but as a society, it can be in the billions. And what I've put there in that second dot point, when I'm writing a grant to kind of, tell a review panel the importance of my work, it is actually more than $40 billion per annum of Australian dollars that mental health problems are costing the country. So one of the things we've known for over a decade now is that half of all lifetime mental health conditions emerge before adolescence. And the fact that we've known that for a long time means we've been trying to work out solutions to prevent and intervene early on so that we don't have those lifetime mental health problems. The onset of an anxiety disorder is typically between 6 and 11 years old. So that's, if you weren't aware of that, it becomes quite a shock. And you think about the people involved with that young person aged 6 to 11, not only the parents, but often teachers are involved. And you'll see that I'm proposing that schools become involved in this part of this prevention for this big problem that we've got. So in adults diagnosed with anxiety disorders, 15 to 30% of them were diagnosed as children. And therefore, it's no surprise that promoting, protecting and improving children and young people's mental health and well-being are top priorities for most countries. So let's look at some examples of what those elevated levels of anxiety look like in children.
Cora is 11 when her mother finds that her daughter...
Try that again.
Cora is 11. What happens when her mother finds that her daughter is unable to make a class presentation because she's so nervous? Rico is only 8. What happens when his father reports that his son is refusing to go to school because he hasn't got any friends, he's avoidant and anxious? Students like Cora and Rico are usually referred to psychological services or community groups. While such interventions provide excellent support, these services are stretched to the limit. Interventions for childhood anxiety are typically expensive to administer, with one-on-one therapy from a trained professional, exacerbated by long waiting times and limited access to providers in the public health system.
So unlike adults with anxiety who can actually tell you, I'm feeling nervous or I'm feeling anxious, as I am now, I'm warming up a bit, but leading up to doing this presentation, I probably wouldn't actually deliver a very good presentation if there wasn't some kind of nerves working away. And I'm able to share that, but children don't. So children often describe physical symptoms. So they often describe tummy aches, or they refuse to go to school, or they could be aggressive, they could be angry in the playground and get into, problems at school. They might be what we call shy, or they might cry a lot, or describe social problems like having no friends. So it's rare that a young child is able to actually name it as anxiety. So what that means is that the symptoms are often recognised through links to other problems. As I said, behaviour problems at school, or learning difficulties, or, parents may have separated and then have noticed that the child has sort of withdrawn and also become maybe a bit aggressive. And then it could be that the child is actually experiencing what, as a psychologist, we know as anxiety and needs some support with that. We know that in Australia, 44% of young Australians with an emotional problem do not actually access treatment. So that's nearly half are not getting what they need. And 2/3 of those are under the age of 12. And some of the barriers that parents report for not seeking treatment is that they had difficulties getting to a mental health care service. So either that could be they lived rurally and there were limited services in their area, or they couldn't afford it. They couldn't get an appointment without really long waiting lists, or they lacked the knowledge of where to go to get help. And those are really quite big numbers, considering if you're having young people with those problems, it could well be that schools are, it's probably a bit of a colloquial term, but barking up the wrong tree, we call it, where, teachers are putting them in learning support and trying to remediate the learning, but it could well be an emotional problem that needs to be dealt with rather than anything to do with a cognitive problem. Could be a bit of both too. So reviews of child mental health services have highlighted the need for services, to be flexible, affordable and accessible treatments. So as I said in the video there, that they're not typically like that. They're typically expensive, administered one-on-one, face-to-face, with a psychologist or counsellor in a clinic setting, or some services are in a school setting. So my past life, if you like, my past career was actually as a school psychologist in a primary school. And so this is, I suppose, really important to me because I saw it at the coalface. I saw classes with young children with anxiety, teachers not really sure what to do, and maybe... Is that someone needs to go on mute?
Yes, Liz, let me just confirm that.
That's okay. Yeah, so I guess this issue, I suppose, has been burning away in me for some time as both a clinician and also now as a researcher. So a research by the name of Kasdan put out a proposal for addressing what we call the treatment gap. So the treatment gap being not enough people are being treated compared to people being identified with the problem. And Kasdan identified 7 crucial attributes of any evidence-based treatments: that they had to have capacity to reach those not well served. In other words, cost, for example, shouldn't stand in the way, or access, as in they may live rurally rather than, in a city. Must have capacity for large-scale delivery. In other words, what I'm about to propose, a school-based intervention that can be in all classrooms rather than just the really expensive one-on-one. No or low cost, administered by non-professionals. So as you saw in the video, the psychologist, obviously, I'm sure in Indonesia it's very similar. Somebody takes at least 6 years of training to develop the skills, whereas if we can serve this problem with non-professionals, still with the skills in delivering it, but not with the 6 years of training, we're better off. Mobility, so being able to move about with the service. So, for example, if a young child is living here in Brisbane and then they move down to Sydney later in the year to attend school, it would be ideal if that treatment could follow the child rather than, oh no, we don't have that down here. Adaptability for diversity. So we've got students with all sorts of needs, whether it be cognitive, cultural, socioeconomic. We've got a whole range of different diversities, so adaptable to that. And also offer a choice of alternatives for clients' needs. So not a one-size-fits-all. So the job of, or I see the innovation here of the job of researchers like myself, is to develop something that meets those 7: innovative, cost-effective, easily accessible, and number 1, early interventions, given that we need something in place before that crucial, round about 11 really, before that age, when lifetime mental health conditions start to be embedded in place. And I know I'm in good company, given that the theme of your conference is celebrating research and innovation. So my research actually focuses on the relationship between anxiety and our ability to store and use information in our working memory. And thank you to Azul for giving us a bit of a background on that. And by those processes, I'm also talking about our ability to shift attention from one thing to another or between 2 tasks. So if you think about a young child in a classroom, they have to shift their attention to the teacher calling out an instruction. They have to maybe inhibit the distraction of the child sitting next to them who might be calling out to them, asking them for a pencil, and then maintain their attention and make decisions and problem solve and use their working memory for the task that's in front of them. And when I explain to people what I do, I say that I use cognitive neuroscience, which is all of these cognitive processes and the understanding of how they work to actually inform treatments for clinical problems. I believe that schools are uniquely placed to deliver prevention interventions for childhood problems, and especially computerised programs that can be delivered on a large scale. There are existing computerised CBT studies, and by that I mean cognitive behaviour therapy, and they've shown mixed results. And my suggestion is that perhaps asking a child, and I'm really targeting, as I said, that aged under 12, like under 11, the primary school kids, it could be that asking them to reflect, articulate, and attend to their inner thoughts might actually require the very resources that they're lacking. So quite often behavioural therapy is something more used with younger children rather than cognitive behavioural therapy that does require young people to be aware of their inner thoughts and feelings and why they're responding in the ways that they are. So my research proposes a theory-driven intervention delivered online in classrooms free of charge with the promise of producing positive emotional changes in children. So meeting all of those criteria of Kasdan's. And of course, it sounds like, as my husband would say, the goose that laid the golden egg, but it does have some promise. So hang in there and I will go through the pros and cons of what I'm suggesting. So in terms of a theory, I've taken something called attentional control theory, and it provides a framework for understanding the relationship between, if you like, attention and memory, or attention and cognitive processes and emotions like anxiety. It proposes that anxiety actually upsets the balance between two systems, a goal-directed or goal-driven and a stimulus-driven. So what actually happens in layman's terms is that a young child in a classroom is trying to do their work, and that's goal-directed, but the stimulus-driven system could be that the work is perhaps too hard, and the young child might go, oh, I'm anxious, and I'm not necessarily naming it as anxiety, but I'm no good at this. I didn't do well at this kind of test last year, and I've never known my times tables. And so they're what we're calling the worrisome thoughts. Or it could well be that a young person is perhaps distracted by their attention is directed to the stimulus of an external, where a principal arrives at the door and they think, oh, I've got in trouble from that principal in the past, so I'm nervous or anxious about what he's coming for, whether he's coming to get me and tell me that I've done something wrong. So in terms of research with adults, I did a lot of this work in my PhD, where I looked at these very much theory-driven, the stress of being in a situation and their natural personality trait, which interacts to predict working memory. And that memory performance can either be in terms of effectiveness or accuracy of the performance, or efficiency, in other words, how long they took to perform the task. And probably no surprises there that working memory had a negative effect. But one thing you may not have been aware of is that it mainly affects not so much the accuracy, but the efficiency. So when we looked at adults, I've got a few publications that have actually shown that the cognition can be intact and just as accurate as a not so anxious person, but they take longer to be able to perform the task. And if you think of that in terms of a classroom situation where a teacher says, right, we've got 10 more minutes, everybody finish up. Well, that anxious child needs a little bit longer to perform the same. So if they don't get that extra time, then they won't be as accurate and they will underperform. So recent work has shown promise for actually training those cognitive processes that are affected by anxiety, and in turn improving mood. So although the arrows on that previous screen were pointing to the right-hand side, it's actually the double-headed arrows between cognition and anxiety that had sort of sparked that idea of, well, is it always going left to right, or is perhaps if we train the working memory, can that arrow go towards the left and therefore reduce the anxiety? If we improve the cognition, can we reduce the anxiety? And what we found with adults over a whole series of papers is yes, it can. Varying degrees of yes, it can, but it certainly has some promise to train. Now, obviously, what we need to know is how many sessions, how often, and, you know, these range of studies with a lot of these people I now collaborate with adults, have shown that typically it can be as little as 10 days of daily training. So there's the studies with adults and some with adolescents. And until a couple of years ago, there were basically no studies that had been done with children, which is where my work comes in. So I conducted originally a pilot study, and you'll get a bit of a giggle out of this because I took 100 primary school children and I divided them into 2 groups. And I really was just seeing whether what they found with adults had any potential to change anxiety levels in children. I roughed it out and said, let's do 2 weeks of daily training on an iPad as part of class. I limited the training to about 10 minutes. Adults were doing about 15 minutes, but I thought that was perhaps a little bit much for children aged 8 to 11. Randomly assigned them to 2 groups. The experimental group trained on something called an adaptive PSAT task, which I'll explain in a minute if you're not sure what that is. And the other half was an active control group. And I wanted a task that looked very similar, but wasn't going to have the cognitive load as the experimental group. And here's the funny part coming up about that task. So just to let you know, the PSAT task is a paced auditory serial addition task. So it's probably better described on the next screen. The children put headphones on and a speaker gives them numbers like 3, 2, and the child is instructed they have to add those 2 numbers, 3 and 2 together, and press 5 on a wheel similar to that black wheel. Then they get another number 4 and they have to add the 2 and the 4 to give 6. Then they get a number 5 and they have to add 4 and 5, so they put 9. So in other words, they're not giving a complete total, they're just constantly adding the last 2 numbers that they heard. And that's something called a PSAT task. The adaptive version that I mentioned on that previous slide adapts to the child's performance. So if they get 4 consecutive items correct, it reduces the amount of time given for the child to respond. But if they get 4 incorrect, it gives them more time to respond, because the idea is that the training is training the cognitive task and not frustrating them or being too easy or too hard. I'll just go back to that previous slide. The 2-back task was literally just the child responding to a number that they saw on 2-back or heard, 2-back. Oops, I'm going back. So on here, for example, they might hear a 3, then a 2. The child would have to put the 3 on the response pad. And if they heard a 4, they would push a 2. So they're just kind of going 2-back and pushing what they heard. There's no addition involved. That's the control task. So our results were really encouraging. We definitely noticed a significant reduction in anxiety from before training to after training. And interestingly, that was still present at 1 month later. But 2 things in the but. The children in the control group improved too. So our task, our 2-back, was actually more demanding than we expected. So we had 2 conditions that both improved in anxiety. The PSAT group, who trained every day for 2 weeks in the addition, reduced their anxiety more than the 2-back group, I will say, but actually not significantly more. So we're still exploring about that, the amount of cognitive demand. But we had a lot of attrition, specifically at the 1 month follow-up. Children found the task too difficult and they dropped out before we could follow them up. So what we did was we thought it was about time we saw who else is doing work very similar to this. So we relied on a systematic review to help us, and we conducted that. We registered it and followed Prospero. I'm sure you've done systematic reviews. And we found, after looking at, over 2,000 articles, we found 12 that were doing similar work to this in terms of cognitive training and trying to reduce emotional symptoms. So I know there's a lot on here, but if you just have a look down the participants column, the second column, there's not many studies that have done under 12. So we've got 10 to 18, 7 to 12. There's one by Begora. And then you've got Lomas, Roberts, and Shannock down the bottom. But mostly they're doing adolescents. So if you have a look across to the fourth column across, the CCT group column, you can see some of them have an adaptive affect. So there's a group of researchers doing a bit of work with affective cognitive control. So rather than just boring adding sets of numbers like I was doing, they're actually putting affective stimuli in there. So stimuli that arouses. In other words, it could be using visuals of things that are actually quite worrisome or scary for adolescents, whereas a PSAT task is just a neutral number. So when we took all of that together and synthesised our information, what we learned from that is to use an adaptive task, to use a targeted either inhibition, shifting or updating working memory task. But for children, it could be neutral or effective. It didn't seem to make a difference. We needed to train between 11 and 15 sessions. In schools was good. And we needed to use the specific sensitive measures of anxiety and depression. And the reason I say that is, I don't think I have it on that slide. Some of the studies actually captured anxiety using something like a strengths and difficulties questionnaire. So it's more of like broad symptoms of stress rather than like a children's anxiety scale. So our next piece of work, we published that one, but our next piece of work was actually to develop a protocol for a randomised control trial. So we were all gung-ho with our ingredients, or our recipe, if you like, from our systematic review. We were going to complete 15 sessions of daily targeted training using the adaptive PSAT, and this time we were going to use a one-back task. In other words, literally just enter the number on the keypad that you just heard, not two back, just the last one. And we said, let's go for that as the low load. Emotional transfer, in other words, change in anxiety symptoms. We used children's anxiety scales. And also we decided to measure updating, inhibition and shifting those cognitive processes at baseline and at follow-up to see whether they had improved as well. If you think of that theory slide I showed you with the double-headed arrow, we wanted to know not only does anxiety improve, that's what we're aiming for, but has memory improved, for example, or has their ability to inhibit or to shift, has that improved? We recruited our first school, but we hit a huge snag. So our children complained from day one that the task was challenging, was boring, and lots of children were withdrawing, not doing the 15 sessions. So we put a hold on our randomised control trial, and we went back and we checked those other studies to see if they also had poor engagement and poor attrition, and they did. So what we thought was, if we stall and find a solution, we can go back and start again, because we liked our protocol, but clearly we can't have, something in place that's an intervention for all children, but they hate doing it. So we were interested in the idea of whether gamifying our cognitive training could perhaps maximise enjoyment and engagement in the task. And so we did another systematic review, which was looking at what gamification features in particular increase motivation and engagement. So by game elements, I'm talking about those of you with children or who've played games yourself will know. It could be that there's little rewards saying, you know, well done, Liz, keep it up. Or it could be a part of that you're a character in a story, in a narrative. Or it could be that you're scoring points or training and competing against another player. So those are what I'm calling game elements. So nearly 1,500 articles were scanned, and we ended up with 18 where they had put gamified cognitive training. So we didn't care whether those cognitive training studies were looking at change in emotions like we were. They might have been training cognitive processes to improve memory or attention or something like that. But we wanted to know about engagement and, retention to the training of the game. This slide's even more overwhelming, but you can see down the second column there, we said that they had to have either a shifting, an inhibition, or a memory cognitive training. It couldn't just be a random game. It had to be cognitive training. And you can see the kind of elements in that middle column. So the narrative, the characters, having scores, rewards. And some of the studies also had other encouragers where they had more tangible things like coaches or parents or, some type of, one of them there, they were remunerated $10 for doing the training. So we also thought that that was interesting to see whether or not we need to be putting those kind of encouragers in there. So after we synthesised those 18 studies, we came up with the fact that that the game elements that are important for engagement are narrative, character, rewards, competition throughout the training, scores displayed once after each level. We found sometimes scores being displayed every single time can actually be demotivating. So we talk about that in the paper as well. And, if we are going to have other encouragers, we can have physical rewards or assistance from either a teacher or a parent. The adaptive nature came up again as being something really important, so that the game was to be neither too hard nor too easy. The context seemed to be, we were on track with school-based, but it could be that a child could still do this at home. Interestingly, the duration 4 weeks, but the number of sessions when you're looking at gamified seemed to be greater with the 24 sessions. And in terms of the outcome measures, many of these studies used self-report, but also observation techniques. And what I mean there is the outcomes in this study were engagement, motivation, and lack of attrition. So in other words, did they report that they were enjoying it, as well as were teachers, parents, and researchers observing them keeping on going with the training? So in terms of directions for our future work, we are currently gamifying an APASAT, a one-back, and a go-no-go task. We're going to take that back to our randomised control trial after we're just about heading into the school holidays here in Queensland. And after the holiday break, we're going to be using that gamified task. We obviously won't be able to use the data we've already collected, but we're going to use the gamified. So it still has the PASAT in the task, but it has those game elements to increase the motivation and engagement. We also want to use that gamified go-no-go or a inhibition task in another project that we got some funding from America to run, looking at reducing maths anxiety and in turn improving maths performance in primary schools. So we've got a bit on the go in terms of using that information about the game elements. I'm just mindful of the time. I think I've only got a few minutes, but I wanted to open this just because I never really like to talk to a group about childhood anxiety without talking about what parents can do. So this was skip verification. I should get to it. Here we go. This was an article that I published in The Conversation about anxiety, and here is 10 things parents and teachers can do to relieve the pressure. And in this article, you will see I actually talk about attentional control theory, and down the bottom I give you the 10 tips about things you can do, whether it's a teacher or a parent, when they identify their child or the student in their class is experiencing anxiety. These are some of the things that that can be helpful. So I guess this is more sort of for your information as well as for the teachers. So we give teachers other information as well when they allow us to come and work with their class. But otherwise, in 10 minutes a day, we're doing the cognitive training. And that is, I guess, more of it's an intervention, but it's a prevention. And when I was talking to Azul about this yesterday, I was saying we're fully aware that the extreme levels of clinical anxiety will probably still need to go one-on-one for some intensive intervention, but hopefully this can help manage some of the highly anxious kind of kid who, and catch them before and give them some strategies before it starts interfering with their schoolwork as well as their daily life. So we're not saying it's an intervention to replace cognitive behaviour therapy, more of a broad brush, lower the anxiety levels across, a whole bunch of children in a classroom, so that, yes, there will still be those ones at the top of the pyramid that need that extra level of intervention. So thank you guys for your attention while I indulged on taking you through our cognitive control training journey. And my email and Twitter is there, so please keep in touch if this is an area of interest. Otherwise, I'm going to unshare and find the button and see if you've got any questions.
Yep. Oh, thank you so much, Liz, for your inspiring talk. As parents, I have lots of questions, but it seems we have several questions in the chat box from the participants.
Right.
Okay. The first question, I just read it through. The first question is from Puri Pramudiani. Dr. Elizabeth, thank you for your interesting topics. I want to ask, do individuals diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, characterized by repetitive checking behaviors, also due to childhood anxiety? And based on your personal experiences or previous research finding, is it possible for individuals with OCD to achieve complete recovery? What are the effective treatment approaches for this condition, especially when it is believed to be innate since childhood? 3 questions over there.
Whoa. Okay, thank you for that question. When you say they're also due to childhood anxiety, correct me if I'm not answering the question that you asked. The study that we run, we do actually use a quite an extensive measure of anxiety that has a domain of OCD. So there's no reason why our intervention couldn't assist with lowering anxiety in OCD. Having said that, I think that if what you're saying you think that the child has a full diagnosis of OCD, I would be thinking that they would be better to go to individual therapy for strategies. There's no reason why my intervention couldn't be happening at the same time for them. When you say, in my experience, I have worked in schools, and as well, we have a not-for-profit organisation here in Australia called Headspace, where I've worked with a lot of anxious children and adolescents. Headspace takes clients from 12 to 25 for no charge. And yes, I have seen recovery. When you talk about complete recovery, I would always tell a young person this is something they do need to top up their levels of strategies. So I would never say to them, you're done. I would just always say to them, there could be a time in their life they go through a stressful life event, an illness or a partner with an illness or relationship problem, or let's face it, many of you are probably PhD students. You couldn't say that's the most relaxing time of your life. Even if everything's going well, it's a stressful time. That's when perhaps that person who was treated for OCD, their anxiety levels might come back up again. And so they need to remember those strategies. It's a bit like a top-up. Yeah. Does that answer that question?
Beautiful. And then, if Bu Puri, you can always contact Liz via email if you have further questions. And let's go to the second question. Thank you, Bu Erin Rita. Thank you, Dr. Adus, for the nice presentation. My question is, some parents do not have much knowledge about anxiety disorder among their children. For problematic children, they think it is just usual children problems and the solution is punishment or discipline. For parents, how to differentiate the problems happen in children to know that it is children delinquency or anxiety disorder?
A really good question. It's interesting because quite often if a parent has experienced anxiety or depression themselves, they are much more likely to recognise that as what is the difficulty for their child. I guess I'd have to say, as a parent, I guess if my usual behaviour management strategies are not working, then it's something else, isn't it? There's some underlying difficulty. If you have a couple of children and you're disciplining them the same way, you're rewarding things you like and ignoring things you don't like, and the difficulty is still there, it could well be that it is some underlying emotional problem. In terms of, is it an anxiety disorder? Maybe not. It could be poor emotion regulation. So they're not able to regulate their emotions without going from 1 to 100 in an instant. The kid that will just kind of go off and blow up. So one of the things that we're doing with our cognitive training I presented to you was about looking at reducing anxiety, but we also put in all those measures in there as well, like rumination, emotion regulation, worry, depression, and I call those covariates of anxiety. So when you say, how do you know if it's an anxiety disorder, it could be one of those other things, anger issues and as well. Yeah, but I'd say it's if your normal parenting and behaviour management strategies that you typically use are not working, it's probably is some other underlying problem.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Liz. We still have time. We still have more or less 10 minutes. The next question is, there are some questions that are a bit overlap. Let me just read it through. From Beauty, thank you, Beauty. Thank you for the insightful presentation. If I may ask, how can we as adults support children and teenagers who suffer from anxiety? Because we aren't experts, our remarks may have exacerbated their fear instead. What is the wise action for us to assist them?
So you can have a look at that article that I wrote for the conversation, but which has your 10 tips. But just to answer that question, a lot can be resolved in terms of warnings. So if I talk to parents of an anxious child, I'll say, don't just come out of the room and say, okay, hop in the car, we're going somewhere. It has to be a little bit of a 10 minutes, you know, Azul will be 10 minutes before I need you to stop what you're doing because we've got to go. Then come back. Azul, we've got another 5 minutes before we need to go. So it's almost like you're counting them down for a little bit of warning and readiness, because typically an anxious child won't respond well to change. If it was Cora, like we saw in the video, who was nervous about doing an oral presentation, it's about preparation, it's about practicing with them and explaining to them that they won't be the only one that is that worried. You know, asking, you know, if they'd like to present in a smaller group, you know, as a practice run, a smaller group of peers, because I know whenever my own daughter was anxious, she'd say to me, I'm not practicing with you, Mum. You always tell me it's great. So I'd have to get some other people that she thought would be more honest for her to practice in front of. And things like that. So yes, there is a lot that you can do as a parent, and then also be using, you know, some of the strategies involved in the therapies, like cognitive behavior therapy, which is getting them to think about their thoughts and depending on the age of the child, whether they'd be able to do that. A teenager would be. Think about linking their thoughts with their behaviours and their actions, because you've probably heard it before that anxiety and depression, they're like a vicious cycle. They almost like feed on itself. So it is about kind of putting a stop to it, otherwise it gets worse and worse. If you're anxious on day 1 and you do nothing about it, you'll be more anxious on day 2 and day 3 and day 4 until the, you know, event comes. Sorry, I could go on all day, but I'm just mindful of the time if there was any other questions.
Yes, we still have a couple of questions. In relation to the previous question, this one is, how do we overcome children and teenagers who suffer anxiety caused by long-term trauma? This is from Asti Taslima.
Really interesting, Asti. Trauma is another one. As the fact that you've asked that, I'm guessing you know a little bit about that. You know, I guess the anxiety I'm talking about in my research, you know, it wouldn't do somebody who's experienced trauma any harm, but it's much more complex because we need to get sort of an understanding of what was that trauma. Was it separation from their caregiver? Was it, you know, something that gave them PTSD, you know, a big accident or death of a loved one, or you know, abuse, and those things respond better to one-on-one treatment, and usually dialectic behaviour therapy actually for some of those, where you're having to, if you like, recondition that young person to unconditional love, more so than just treating sort of a little bit of anxiety. They're a much more complex case. I don't know if that helps you, but in schools in Queensland, they're starting to get more and more into trauma-informed schools, but they're not still talking about intervening for that trauma. They're just teachers being aware that a complex need of a child might have a traumatic background to it, but the treatment of that is left to a professional like a school psychologist or an external psychologist.
Thank you, Liz. It's also the problem for us, I think, as parents. It's hard to get access to professional helps. here. And just like what you said yesterday, even in Australia, there are shortage of counselor and professionals. Yeah. Can we take one more question? We still
Sure.
have two actually. Let's see. This one is from Rizka Nalida or Alida. Thank you for the very thoughtful presentation. I think implementation of gamification into an application should be carefully deliberated. My question is how to prevent us from creating a poorly designed gamified facade, such as the bad selection of elements in the process of gamified facade, incohesive programs, etc.
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question, but I totally agree. The last thing we need to do is spoil what the PSAT is doing, which is training the updating function or working memory. So the PSAT part will remain the way it is with the, the numbers being presented orally into headphones and the child responding. It's the wraparound story, if you like, to the game. So it could talk about, you're a character and you're going on a journey and you need to collect 50 golden nuggets or something, and you perform this first trial. Well done. Now you collected 2 nuggets. Now you do another trial and collect another 2 nuggets. Well done. You collected your 15 nuggets for the session. I don't know, I made that up, but that the PSAT itself would remain the same. So one of the things I'm actually about to write is a funding proposal to for this particular one, we're gamifying on the basis of the systematic review because I have a PhD student who's keeping on needing to going on. But I'm about to write a grant proposal this weekend, actually, to get some funds to actually do a user analysis so that we're actually got kids working with the game developers to actually compare, the gold nugget story versus the, you're going on a trip to outer space and you have to collect meteors or something, like to actually see what, because it's we know to put a narrative in there, but we're not the experts in knowing what narratives are going to be more appealing one over another. But I'm not sure if that answered your question, but the PSAT would remain the same. Although, interestingly, my collaborator in Belgium who is doing the work with adults, he was looking at his own young child recently, and he said, she's too young. She's only 5. She's too young to add numbers together, but she could actually add colours together. And we were thinking, wow, there's another whole way of looking at the updating function to actually listen to colours and add 2 colours together and respond. So there's a heap of different variations, but you're right, if it's not actually tapping the cognitive process, then, we would throw it out, that novelty, because the whole idea is we want to tap into the theory that we understand of the cognitive processes. So we'd have to be sure that adding 2 colours was actually tapping that updating function.
Oh, thank you, Liz.
Hopefully that's a whole lifetime of my research taken care of, narrowing it all down.
Thank you. We still have actually one question, but we ran out of time. Now, Liz, would you mind if I send your PPT PowerPoint presentation to the participants so they can access the, if they want to read the link to the conversation?
Happy to have any feedback or ideas or questions, because it only helps to improve what I do. And, as they say, more heads are better than one.
Yeah. Thank you. And then Liz's email address is going to be there. So please feel free to contact Liz if you have any further question, inquiries about the topic today. Thank you again, Liz, for your insightful presentation. You have reminded us that, this is my quote of the day, promoting, protecting, and improving children and young people's mental health and well-being are our top priorities. I think should be our top priorities as educators and as parents as well. And I'm sure participants will think, with them something to learn and contemplate from your talk.
Thank you.
As the closing, we would like to present certificate of appreciation virtually.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you for joining us.
Lovely.
Thank you for inspiring talk. Again, a round
Thank
of
you, and
applause
thank you for your
Liz.
attention, and enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Liz.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Everyone, participants, now it's time for the last presentation. Our next speaker is already here with us, joining us far away from Warwick University, UK, Associate Professor Sue Johnson-Wilder. Good morning, Sue. Is it still morning in Warwick? Yes, it's 9 a.m. Yeah. How are you going? How's a beautiful summer in UK at the moment?
It's
raining
beautiful today.
Beautiful.
It's beautiful today, yeah.
And blue sky. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Let me introduce our speaker. Sue is Associate Professor of Math Education and a coach for mathematical resilience. Wow, it's a big thing. Her background is secondary math teaching, teacher development, mentoring, and coaching. For the last 15 years, she has specialized in addressing math anxiety, developed the growth zone model, and the mathematical resilience framework. She is co-founder of the International Mathematical Resilience Network, which currently has branches in 8 countries. She is working with colleagues on the Mathematical Resilience book. She supervises PhD, supports teacher accent research and design-based research, and gives presentation about developing mathematical and statistical resilience worldwide. We are very lucky to have Sue here today with us. Her presentation entitled, "What Can We Learn from Applying the Mathematical Resilience Framework?" Let's welcome Associate Professor Sue Johnson-Wilder. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay.
Yes.
Tell me if there's
Please
any
do.
problems. Is that good?
All good?
Okay. So good afternoon, esteemed colleagues in Indonesia. It's a real privilege to speak with you today, and also to follow on from Liz's presentation, because I think there will be great connections between her presentation and mine. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we address anxiety, but in the context I work, it's maths and statistics anxiety. And my view is that that's relevant to social sciences and physical sciences, because maths and statistics are important tools in your own work. I just want to share with you this little anecdote before we start. What happens when you start to talk about feelings in mathematics, this is in the UK, so my data for today comes from the UK, but I'm very aware that it mirrors data in these other countries that we work with. The children feel panic when math starts, and this leads them to not be able to think. One girl said that's why she cries in most math lessons. One of the boys said his hands go prickly and his chest makes it hard to take a breath. Now, Siti started the connection between the two talks by talking about the importance of promoting and improving mental health and well-being. And obviously I'm talking about mathematical well-being, but this is entirely connected to children's well-being. And the thing is that if we don't start these conversations, we don't realise how much the children are suffering, and then we don't do something about it. So maths and statistics anxiety interferes with the process of doing maths or stats. It probably affects your learners, your parents and your teachers. I've worked with English language specialists who have quite bad maths anxiety. It's contagious. We know it's prevalent across the world. In England, we're used to thinking of 30% being fairly severely affected, whereas in Brazil, where we're working, it's more like 40%. The impact includes avoidance, so students and adults choosing not to go and do more mathematics and choosing to avoid maths lessons. And in the literature, wider literature, and in general pedagogy, it's quite often ignored or is not taken seriously. So I'm going to introduce the term psychological safety. I think we all know about how to keep children physically safe, at least I hope we do. But there's this other factor, psychological safety, which is required in order to avoid developing further anxiety. And Ryan and Decky talk about 3 criteria for a learner to be psychologically safe in a lesson or in homework or wherever we work with them. They are relatedness, autonomy, and competence. In England, competence is being reinterpreted as mastery, and I think that's something that would resonate in Indonesia. Autonomy is about the learners having a voice, and you'll see that they use the voice in the data that I'm going to share with you today. And relatedness is about building a relationship of belonging and trust in the maths lessons and in the context where they learn maths. And these 3 are very important. And I would add competence to self-safeguard, to keep your mathematical well-being safe and your academic well-being safe in the face of significant adverse pressure. So I'm going to suggest that competence to self-safeguard can be achieved by using 3 tools, which I call is part of what I call the mathematical resilience framework. And I'm going to introduce them to you today. They're the growth zone model, the hand model of the brain, and the relaxation response. And I'm going to evidence the claim that if we share these tools between teacher or teaching assistant or coach or parent and students, the tools will help improve dialogue, improve awareness, and improve appropriate responses to reduce maths anxiety and academic anxiety more generally. Now, you may already all know this, but when I started this work, I didn't know quite all this. So I'm going to share it in hope that I teach some of you something new. As a survival, and also to bear in mind that we are not psychologists. Most of us in this audience are educators. And so we're part of a bridge between the psychological specialists, but the educators that meet with the learners every day, and the certain skills that I think we need to have, and not keep relying on psychologists, given that we're talking about 30% of the population in the UK and whatever it is in Indonesia. So the brain is constantly seeking to distinguish challenge from threat to well-being or survival. And what I hadn't realized is that the brain remembers physical threats like fire or spiders maybe, because mum perceives spider as a threat. But there are also social threats that they experience or that they watch other people experiencing, like being left behind or humiliated or shouted at. And if you imagine being a monkey or a horse, if you were being left behind from your group, that could be a threat to your life. So we have to remember that we're partly social animals as well as incredibly clever and talented human beings. And those previous threats are remembered. And when the brain perceives a threat that's a bit like something it experienced before, it initially responds by going into fight or flight mode. And I have a colleague at work, for example, who, if she is about to go into a maths classroom, she's not a maths teacher, she runs Warwick in Africa, and she's about to go into a maths classroom and she finds herself panicking. And she wasn't aware why until we talked about this, because she'd had such a bad experience of school mathematics. So the first tool I want to introduce you to is the growth zone model. And this came about, it was invented in a supervision with a wonderful PhD student called Mary Lugalia, and you can read her PhD online. We were looking at how to make algebra more accessible using technology. And I've got an Indonesian PhD student doing much the same here with me at the moment, and he's read Mary's thesis. And we could have started to invent this, and then it's developed from there. And so we noticed that that everybody talks about being in the comfort zone in the UK. I hope that's an expression that's known in Indonesia. So we know that there are spaces outside the comfort zone where we feel a bit uneasy. So when you step out of your comfort zone, you might feel challenged, you might feel uneasy, you might feel a little bit energy elevated, but you can still think and plan and recruit support and do various other things. And so you're in the growth zone, not the danger zone or the panic zone. If you're in the panic zone, you're in fight and flight mode, and you cannot think because it's as if there's a tiger in the room. We'll do some more work on this shortly, but that's the growth zone model that we introduced. And then the second tool I'm going to introduce you to is Dan Siegel is a neuroscientist in the States, and his model is a hand model of the brain. So our human brain is made up of a primitive part of the brain, which is 100 million years old in terms of its mechanism, and has kept alive crocodiles and all sorts of critters. And then there's a sort of cortex and then a prefrontal cortex. And the lovely thing about this model, well, several lovely things. One is you carry it around with you all the time. Another one is that it's accessible to learners as young as 6, Daniel has found. And what he says is that the thumb represents the stored memory, the alarm system, if you will. That's made up of the hippocampus and the amygdala, but we can, as teachers, think about it as the alarm system. And then if you fold your hand over to represent how you're feeling now, when you're not feeling threatened, the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, this is represented by your fingernails. So the place where your brain does mathematics is in the fingernails. And the model of what happens when you panic is that happens, the right-hand side of the model. And your alarm system takes over, and the prefrontal cortex goes effectively offline. So you can't, go back to that, you can't think and panic at the same time. So you feel stupid. We'll come back to that. The third important tool was discovered in the West by Herbert Benson, who's medical psychiatrist, I believe. And his 2000 version of his book has a reflection about how long it's taken him to bring the relaxation response awareness into the West. In Eastern countries, it tends to be better known about. And now we use it, we call it mindfulness in Western schools, and we've caught up a little bit. The idea that if your brain is in panic mode, you can trigger relaxation and back to being able to think again by using your rest and digest system. One of the strategies we can teach is 5-7 breathing, breathing in for 5 and out for 7. Some youngsters don't respond well to that, so we can ask them to think about 5 things they can hear. And these I call micro-mindfulness techniques, because obviously we can teach youngsters in other lessons more about mindfulness, but I'm talking about things where the panic is triggered actually in the lesson. And if the child is more anxious in the lesson, and my daughter has bipolar and suffers from anxiety, she would be given a red card by the teacher, and that would mean that she could go to walk to the special centre. And then by the time she got there, she would probably have calmed down because she'd got away from whatever it was panicking. The key message here is for the learners and also for the adults and the parents and the teachers is don't try to do maths while your brain is focused on the maths monster. And the fourth tool, because there is a fourth tool, we're adding tools as we go along, is the idea of a ladder. And this is familiar to teachers as scaffolding, but we don't tend to share it with learners. And so on the left, you have a young person who's trying to learn a difficult science or statistical concept, and they have enough rungs for them to get up to learning that particular concept. Whereas the learner on the right is stuck because there are some rungs missing. And I used this not long ago, taking some children outside to help them understand why it was x plus 3, because this 16-year-old had completely missed it. And her, with the new rungs of doing it in practice, her eyes lit up and she became an ambassador for learning in the classroom. And so we're saying we're not blaming you, the learner, but you just need to say, I need another rung. And then the teacher may not know where the other rungs are, but somebody will, and they will be re-included and not blame themselves for not being able to make progress in that topic. So they're not stupid, they need another rung. And Eliz mentioned the trauma word. I want to think with you about maths anxiety as an example of an experience of adverse experience and possibly trauma. And Brené Brown, who's a researcher in shame in the States, said what the learners experience is if nobody else is talking about it, it must be just me. And they feel very isolated, and they think they're the only one that doesn't get it. And that can be a quite difficult experience. And as you saw from the first slide, even to quite young primary school children. So some of the adverse prior experiences that youngsters have in learning mathematics and some science subjects is that maths is either right or wrong. There is no middle way. And then when the children are introduced to the growth zone model, they will say, but I don't have a growth zone in maths. I go straight from green to red. Now, that would be the case if we set certain tasks and the answers came back tick or cross. And my suggestion is that answers that are right or wrong, or questions that are right or wrong, belong in the green zone, where you're testing, giving practice to learners' understanding of mathematics, and they don't give scope for growth. And these are examples from students who've been in Warwick. Halima and Nina both came as adults to the Centre for Lifelong Learning, and Molly wanted to be a teacher. And they had these adverse experiences of a teacher saying, you don't understand, you're stupid. And she didn't have the language of, I just need another rung. And Nina, I don't get it, I still don't get it. So she's lived with humiliation in her previous maths experience, and it's affected her quite badly. And as Peter Levine would say, the body keeps the score. That anxiety carries in to their next experience in science or social science when they're asked to learn some maths or some statistics. And Molly's father, so it's not just school, sometimes it's parents, and it could be other experiences. Molly's father would grab her neck because he got it and she didn't, and he didn't have the skills of adding the new rungs. I have to tell you that Molly, who learned about mathematical resilience, is now a teacher. In fact, she's a head of geography locally, and she was perfectly capable. We just needed to deal with the impact of those adverse prior experiences. The reason I use the expression the maths monster is because we ran a course for staff at Warwick. We've done a survey. Warwick is a prestigious university in the UK. And it turns out that about a third of the staff members and about a third of the students at Warwick also have maths anxiety or stats anxiety. And we ran this lovely course called Maths with Chocolate, where we use, for example, Smarties when we deal with statistics. And we use a bar of chocolate when we're trying to explore multiplication, which is a sticking point for many adults in the UK. And at the end of this course, the lady said, thank you for rescuing me from the maths monster. So although this monster's not real in the physical sense, it's very real in a psychological sense, and it's experienced by a lot of people. So maths anxiety is like an invisible monster. It's acquired, it's disabling. And then I start to get a bit passionate. It's been written about since the 1950s. We've known about it. Actually, it turns out there's booklets since the 1940s, but I've only just discovered those. It now affects large numbers of people. It causes reduced or backwards progression. So if you get learners in England coming to do a resit at the age of 17 of their GCSE, they might get a lower grade at the end of a year if their maths anxiety and their prior experiences are not addressed. And the point is here that that's a big waste of money, it's a big waste of resource, and it's a big impact on every country's economy. And it can be addressed. So your social sciences don't have to carry on saying, I can't do statistics. And your physical sciences students don't have to keep dropping out or panicking or underachieving if you're teaching them mathematics, to speak mathematics in their subject. So what Claire and I have offered is a term rooted in positive psychology, because maths anxiety is the problem. Now we want to talk about the solution. A learner's stance towards mathematics that enables pupils and other learners to continue learning despite finding setbacks and challenges in their mathematical learning journey. And that includes occasionally getting into the panic zone. And they need to learn how to deal with those things, and then they will be resilient to what happens to them in the future. So back to the growth zone model. What we need learners to do is to accept feeling stupid in the red zone as temporary, just to recognise that when they're in the red zone, the brain's gone offline. They need to learn how to get out of the red zone, which will involve triggering the relaxation response. They need to build experience of being in and extending the orange zone. And they need and then they need to be encouraged to come out of comfort, because they've had prior bad experiences or trauma. They're going to be very resistant to creeping out of their comfort zone. So the green zone shows itself in lessons where the children or the learners can build self-confidence, they can practice automaticity, they can do their homework in the green zone, things that they've already mastered. So that's about current mastery and about what they already know. The red zone is where what you're asking of the learner isn't within their reach yet, but because we hold a growth mindset, it will be one day. And if you put them in the red zone, their mathematical well-being is under threat, because they're panicking and they will feel they can't understand, and they will feel stupid, and nobody's talked about it, so it must be just me, I can't do mathematics. You're not stupid, you're panicking. Panic is temporary. Martin Seligman is the father of positive psychology in the West, and he says to build resilience, learners need to understand that this state is temporary. So it's okay to panic, because that's a natural human reaction to a situation you can't handle, and that you need to find a way of getting out of it back to the challenge and the comfort spaces. And then you will be able to handle the problem with support in some cases. Now, with the hand model of the brain, I don't think I'm going to try showing you these, because that feels like risking. But I'm assuming Citi's going to send you the slides. Dan Siegel explains his model beautifully in a way that you can share with parents and families of children who have moments of anxiety before it becomes a big problem. Remember, we're educators, we're not therapists. We're not dealing with the key critical cases. We're trying to educate children and learners to give them tools to help them understand themselves and to optimize their learning. And what I've done in the second link is I've made a little video of how it works in maths, in the context of maths, because I find sometimes people aren't good at transitioning from one context to another, and Dan Siegel explains it in a generic way, whereas I'm explaining it in the specific maths anxiety way. And I find, and my colleagues and researchers find, that if you don't talk about this in the context of maths, in England anyway, people just assume that they're stupid at maths, and all their relaxation responses and their hand models, etc., apply to everything else, but don't apply to mathematics and statistics. Whereas if we learn it in the context of mathematics, it gets applied outside. So if you like, maths anxiety is possibly one of the most intractable problems, or has been in the past, partly because of this fixed mindset, colonial, if you will, idea that maths is somehow only for the elite whereas actually in our economies, we need 90% of the population to be effectively numerate. So let's talk a little bit more about the growth zone. This is where new learning happens. Learners experience challenge. They need sufficient safeguarding, so they need to know that they might get into the red zone and how to get out of it. And they need to learn from what I'm going to call growth promoting feedback, which is built into some of the computer games. If you make a mistake, you learn from the system how to improve it, but isn't always built into traditional education practices. So in the growth zone, where they're learning optimally, they will make mistakes, and it should be safe to make mistakes. It shouldn't be a system of humiliation. They should feel that they expect to get stuck and know how to handle it. They might need to ask for support, and they might get pretty tired. And part of this growth zone is what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. You may have come across flow already, but there are other less totally engaged experiences within the challenge space. The growth zone includes 4 key elements, which I'm hoping will be familiar to some of you, but I'm just going to pop through them because they're problematic in quite a lot of pedagogy that I observe around the country and in other countries. The first one is the growth mindset. So this is I know we get miscues about what growth mindset is in the UK. It's the belief that maths ability is like a muscle. You haven't got it or you haven't got it. It's like a muscle, and if you use it, it grows. And you have to keep being prepared to use it. And then you have to be prepared to struggle in the growth zone. So you need persistence, which is keeping going, having a go. And then when it's not working, you need perseverance, which is to try a different strategy or to recruit some help. Now, we mostly find in math lessons that these opportunities are not being built for these experiences of struggle. It's kind of tell and then practice pedagogy. And what we're saying is that we need a mixed pedagogy where sometimes we give the kids something that they haven't learned before and they struggle with it. We also need, the ideally would be intrinsic motivation. A lot of maths teachers have intrinsic motivation. They love maths for its own sake. But an awful lot of the rest of the population don't love maths for its own sake. If they're scientists and social sciences, it might be a tool, but they quite often say, why do I have to learn 3x3 matrices if I'm learning about biochemistry, for example? Yeah. So what we have to try and tap into is their values, what it is they want to achieve, and how the maths that they're learning relates to those values. And Ryan and Decky call that autonomous motivation, which is the next best thing to intrinsic motivation in terms of harnessing the natural learning power of the learner. And then finally, that growth zone has to involve support and relatedness, that sense of being able to recruit support, to be belonging, not excluded from the community of mathematical learners, and not to be left out because of elitism. So some of the strategies that we expect teachers to be using already, but they could develop further, to build the experience of being in the growth zone, is to create a culture where the learners make mistakes, where we say, oh, that's an interesting answer. Why did you say that? And what can we learn from it? So being expected to learn from mistakes, not humiliated by making mistakes. We want the learners to feel confident and safe enough to ask questions, to think about trying a simpler example, to support each other, whether it's in the lesson or whether it's in the relaxation period or whether it's at home with homework and mobile phones in Jakarta because it's an urban area. They might use the internet if they're not quite sure what a term means, and there's quite a lot of resource on the internet. They should expect to get stuck and to learn that sense of being stuck means, oh, great, I'm stuck, I could start learning now, rather than being horrified. One of the things that's happening in England is less and less use of rough work, and the children seem to be expected to write it down exactly correct. And so we need space for them to scribble, if you like. And so after courses that I run, the primary teachers quite often bring in paper tablecloths or whiteboards to give the children rough space, that they need to be allowed to take time, because growing new neurons, the growth of the brain, the mathematical part of the brain, takes time, and be prepared to have a go. So that means creating a growth zone space in the teacher's classroom. So the model is a means to help learners understand and articulate their feelings when they're learning mathematics. And it gives them a way to safeguard their mathematical well-being. Now, it may be that it's talked about out loud in a lesson, or it may be that we just talk about it and then leave them to think about it, depending on the age of the child. But the principle is that this tool can help all learners. So now, if I've got time, I'm doing. I'm going to discuss with you why we're really here, which is what happens when teachers introduce the growth zone model. And so all the italics from now on are data from teachers from the most recent work group that we ran. But I've been doing this for 5 years. The work groups of this kind involve 4 afternoons, so 4 lots of 2 hours over a period of time, where we introduce them to maths anxiety, we introduce them to the maths resilience framework, then they go and try out. So between the first session and the second session, they talk to kids about their feelings about maths, or they might do a questionnaire. And then in the second session, we introduce the tools, and we see what the teachers find happens when they start using them with a class or an individual student. This particular teacher has noticed that by talking and acknowledging that learning something new might make you feel uncomfortable, this made a noticeable difference to her students, who are more willing to ask for help or saying they didn't understand. And the culture of the maths lessons, in her case, became more about understanding process than getting to the correct answer. So that's the growth zone space, where the answer isn't important. It's that process of understanding the concepts that is really important in the growth zone. And I just want to emphasize that this happened with just these 2 short interventions with regular class teachers, and then support online, but most of them didn't access that. Another teacher says, my year 7 support group, so this support groups of children with difficulties, are now more willing to stretch and challenge themselves and push themselves into the orange, the growth part of the model. They can confidently tell me where they are on the zone model for each task we do. And that's important if you can enable it to happen in a group. Support groups are typically quite small, because every task will initially put a child in a different zone, depending on what the triggers are, depending on what they know already, depending on their prior experience. And so they need to understand, I'm in my red zone or I'm in my yellow zone. And if I'm not in my growth zone, my orange zone, then there's something I can do to move into that space to grow. So she says she not only now gets that visual representation out if a student has shut themselves down because they've got into red and they're trying to get out of red into yellow, and the teacher doesn't know what's going on in the child's brain, but if the diagram comes out, the child can put a penny or something on the red zone to show that they've gone into red zone and they need time to get out of there before they can answer a maths question. So this is another teacher. She can tell the children, tell her when the work's too easy and they need something more challenging. Please, can I have a harder question? And students have been able to tell her when these are in my yellow, but I'm getting near the red zone, miss. And so they might need some support. And so when they're working individually or in groups, this is an important part of the classroom dialogue, because otherwise it's the teacher choosing the different tasks for the children to work on without knowledge of what zone it's putting the learner into. It also had the effect of increasing understanding of the other members of the group. It helped the students to see that everyone has a different level for every task we do. And so that stopped them feeling that they were the only one that was getting into red or getting into being too safe in green. This extract for me is really important, because the teacher planned 2 sessions with the primary children. And the second session had to be adapted because the teacher wasn't aware of the level of panic that the children were experiencing when they were introduced to a piece of mathematics. She introduced it to 4 children in this group. All of them said they felt at the end more positive about maths, that it's okay to struggle and not be sure straight away. So it's sad to know that what they're learning is in maths, it's not okay to struggle and it's not okay to be sure straight away. And so their growth zone's missing completely. And so they're less worried. Another child said that they used the breathing that they'd been taught to do something else. And so it's impacting on other parts of their school life, and it's reducing anxiety around the campus, which is really important given Liz's talk. Students start to understand learning maths as a journey, not either right or wrong, you either got it or you haven't, but as a learning journey through a particular element. And that if they're in the growth zone, it's not comfortable. Staying in the green zone is comfortable, but it's not growth. So they're not going to grow and learn what they're capable of. And this teacher felt that this whole intervention was a great success. So using these tools in practice in lessons, you're building a shared language for mathematical safeguarding. You might give a learner a copy of the diagram. You might give the learners opportunity to write their own words for each of the feelings in each zone. You might put posters up, depending on the age group of the children. And the thing that's really hard for maths and science teachers in particular, because they think if they keep talking, we think if we keep talking, the learner will come to understand, is if the learner's in the red zone, you have to stop talking and let the learner recover their thinking brain. Otherwise, you're wasting your time because there's an alarm going off in their head. So now I offer you an enhanced growth zone model to summarize where we've got to so far. That the growth zone part of the growth zone diagram has 4 elements. One is collaboration and struggle. Is that happening in your statistics, in your maths parts of your courses? Is there clearly value and autonomous motivation being triggered to learn these topics? Why are we learning this? What's its connection to my values? Are you engaging the peers in learning, and are you engaging relatedness, that sense of belonging and being part of a group that's learning and helping each other learn on this learning journey? And is the growth mindset being established where mistakes become something to learn from? And in fact, more neurons grow when you make mistakes and pay attention to what those mistakes mean than in typical teaching and practice lessons. It's important for us to understand that. So what I want, or what I propose for Indonesia as well as the UK, is that all the maths teachers and all the stats teachers and all the teachers working with the use of maths or statistics will work with a significant proportion of students that have stats or maths anxiety in front of them. And I think so there's 3 levels of training that we need to introduce into the country. The first level is anxiety awareness of why some of youngsters will avoid stats or maths like the plague, or do that sort of thing. When you say, I'm a maths teacher, they do that. And you might say, what happened to you? Because there'll be a story behind that avoidance. So everybody in your country, I propose, needs to be maths anxiety or anxiety aware. And then some of you need to be anxiety informed practitioners like these teachers who can use this framework or something similar to work with children and learners who exhibit anxiety around stats or mathematics. And what we need to do is learn to recognize it from the behavior or by asking the learners about their sense of the stats or the maths. And in particular, seek to resist causing further harm. If you have a bunch of youngsters who have to do maths, who have already got maths anxiety, and you just dive straight in with more maths, it's quite likely that they will be in their red zone and they will continue to believe that they're stupid. And that will not do their well-being any good at all. So then we need to establish psychologically safe teaching environments that enhance achievement in maths and statistics and science and social sciences. And again, back to our data from this latest group, the teacher said she felt strongly that the strategies we'd given them had prevented them from becoming more anxious in the lessons. Another teacher said we constantly refer to these zones and get students to choose which question to complete to make sure that they're in their yellow zone to maximise their learning. Obviously, if they start to panic, then you intervene and give them an easier task, etc. This little man said, I hated maths. It made me feel stupid. I just didn't get it. Now I understand, because we've had this conversation, it needs to be hard for my brain to work and grow. That's why if I'm always in green, I wouldn't make progress. I can also say how I'm feeling, so my anxiety doesn't get confused with me being angry. So you can imagine there are a lot of young children in England who behave as if they are angry, as if they are rude, as if they are just naughty. And actually, they might be suffering from maths anxiety. And if we can identify those and solve it, we'll get a much bigger cohort being able to study mathematics. This is an important point, that because learners are used to going from green to red, they need to notice when they're not in red, they're in yellow, and notice the difference between excitement and engagement and challenge and that sense of being nervous because they're doing something new and something they don't yet know how to do, and being in the red zone. The main difference between the yellow zone and the red zone is that in the red zone, as we saw from the hand model of the brain, you can't think. If you can still think, but you're nervous, you're probably in the yellow zone. And we need to practice noticing which zone we're in. And I've got pictures of teachers from around the world getting the youngsters to notice what zone they're in and talk about what they observe, like their heart racing, etc. The class teacher and the senior leadership team observed of some of these children that they didn't need as much reassurance as they had, and they were getting on their own. And then one of the teachers worked with parents, and this is a sad extract, that this parent had extreme maths anxiety. The mention of the word sent her into panic attacks. And now she's playing maths games with her children, and the whole family is growing in confidence. And imagine if that's happening in every maths anxious family, of which there might be 1 in 3 in the country. So together, we can tackle the very real invisible maths monster. We can build awareness. We can develop a shared language, and I'm offering you one particular language. We can enable learner autonomy, that the learners choose a task that puts them in their growth zone rather than hiding in green or panicking in red, and communities that don't leave people behind. And I wanted to share this extract from the parents. The parents and mums were so relieved to hear that maths anxiety is real. They weren't the only ones who felt physically sick when they're trying to help their children with maths. And bear in mind what Brené Brown said about if it's not talked about, you think you're the only one. They loved the approach of safeguarding and hadn't thought about how to heal these maths adverse experiences, or we might call them trauma, because they leave an impact in the body. Everyone needs to hear this message. So I believe the future involves building the Mathematical Resilience Network globally to share ideas, resources, findings and support. And I hope it's something that Indonesia, I know lots of people in Indonesia read these articles, will wish to join to tackle the impact of maths anxiety as well as general academic anxiety, and allow mathematical learning to flourish. To support teachers with action research, and that's one of the things that we try and do in the UK, and I'm sure you would like to do in Indonesia with support from the wider group. And I want to end by asking you a question. To what extent is current practice in Indonesia growth promoting? Are the learners spending time in their growth zone? The tests they give the children, are they growth promoting? Is the feedback of a kind that the learners can learn how to improve from? And is the formative feedback, the teacher feedback, currently growth promoting? Is it about informing the children so that they learn from their mistakes and they grow? Or is it about informing the teachers so they can teach differently? Because both are needed. And that's the challenge I'd like to lay down to the audience. And in the slide, I've left you with some further reading, which I hope you will appreciate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. The last the question that you have posted are very thought-provoking questions. I mean, as educators and as parents, I think we should reflect on that based on the questions as well. So okay. Right, we have it's time for Q&A. Or so do you want participant to respond that question like open mic, or should we go to Q&A, straight to Q&A?
I suspect it might be more inclusive to do it as chat, because some people might be worried about their English.
All right.
But I'm really happy with either. It's just I want to make sure it's inclusive.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. Now I will read through the questions. The first one is from Isi Aziza. Thank you, Isi. Thank you for your insightful presentation, Sue. I have a question. How to improve students' learning autonomy in answering math question? I experienced some students ended up with demotivated feeling to finish some question that they find difficult.
Okay, so do you have in your lesson a way in which the children can say, this question is in my red zone?
Okay.
Because is it difficult and challenging, or is it difficult and threatening? And I suggest at the moment that the teacher doesn't know which is going on. And so once you introduce that language and vocabulary, the autonomy comes in the learner saying, could I have an easier question, sir? That one's in my red zone. And then you will increase the motivation. Does that help answer the question?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I mean, like in your slide as well, you posted tips here for educators to help students and perhaps as a self-reflection as well to change our mindsets. I think this one will also contribute to your answers. And then another question is from Jihan Fakhira. Thank you, Dr. Sue, for the presentation. I would like to ask you a question. What strategies can individuals employ to overcome math anxiety and develop a positive attitude toward mathematics? That's the first question.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so if we go back to the enhanced growth zone model, I'm not sure if Jihan is thinking about the teacher or the learner at this point in time. But if it's about the learner, then they need those 4 elements. They need to believe in their own mathematical growth, and that if they've got enough rungs in the ladder, they will be able to learn the mathematics. They need to ask questions of the world around them about why this mathematics is of value to the person trying to teach it to them, so they can try and understand why it might be of value to them. And those questions, if lots of learners ask them, the teachers will get the idea that they need to understand why this is of value. They need to understand from the growth zone model that sometimes it takes effort and struggle and wrestling and support to get your head around an idea. And that doesn't mean that you're not good at maths. It means that you're human. And they need value, struggle, growth, and they need support. So they need to recruit support. I'll tell you a story about Molly. She was being a teaching assistant before she became a teacher. She still had maths anxiety, but she and I were working on it. And she went and told the maths teacher that she was wanting to do the maths the school teacher maths test so that she could become a teacher. And he was very kind, and he said, come and talk to me anytime if you want to learn some more mathematics. So she went to him and said, y is a third equal to 0.3 recurring. And he didn't have the rungs. And he said, well, it just is. And that wasn't what she was looking for. But in her mind, because she had these tools I've explained to you, she knew that she had to find somebody else who could give her the rungs to help understand that. And so she put that as a limitation on the teacher and not on her capability as a learner of mathematics. And that helped her to overcome math anxiety and develop a positive attitude. So these tools, these 4 tools, are quite protective, the ones I've offered to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now the second question from Jihan. I wonder, are individuals with high math anxiety will always have a good grades in math achievement or in math, or vice versa?
That is such a good question. So a lot of people used to think that because math anxiety lowers your achievement individually. So if I'm an A grade student, I might only get a B or a C. I might still get an A, but it would wear out my coping system in my body, and I might develop quite severe anxiety problems. If I'm a C grade student, I might only get a D or an E or an F. So the thing is that it affects achievement for everybody if they have maths anxiety. And so what we find is that there is maths anxiety in the high achieving groups, and there's maths anxiety in the low achieving groups. And in the high achieving groups, it's quite often related to the lack of the growth zone in the pedagogy. So, for example, a very talented group of year 9s might be used to getting 10 out of 10, and then they suddenly get 5 out of 10 because they haven't understood what happens if you put a minus outside a bracket. And I'm talking about this story from experience. My daughter was in the class, and they might panic, and then nobody does anything about it. Nobody talks, so they think it's just them. And actually that's quite simply solved by checking in with the learners and then giving them a chance to understand that concept. So the people with high grades are typically perfectionists who are used to getting 10 out of 10 and aren't used to struggling. And when they have to struggle, and when they need to be in their growth zone, they feel that maybe their maths ability isn't up to it. And we get a lot of those students at Warwick because we recruit high attaining students onto our maths and science courses. And if they run into difficulty and they're not used to struggling, then they would be anxious. Whereas if we have experienced challenge in our youth growing up, we would understand that that's a normal part of learning maths, science and social sciences. So absolutely, it goes across the attainment range and it has different causes, but it's not just a lower or high attainers problem. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Sue. We still have more or less 7 minutes while waiting for other questions from participants. I actually have, oh, okay, there's one question coming from Haura Zainab. Let me just read it. It is in Indonesian, then I will translate it into English. Bagaimana saran Dr. Sue untuk memulai berkontribusi dari generasi muda sekarang terhadap perkembangan yang ingin terus meningkatkan STEM? Okay. Okay, how young generation, this is about STEM, how young generation can contribute to the development of STEM? That's basically the questions.
How
younger
generation?
Yeah, younger generation, young people can contribute to the development of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, I think discipline, perhaps.
Okay, what an interesting question. I would like to think that we can teach our youngsters that STEM is a really important part of our education. At the moment, we tend, I don't know about you in Indonesia, but in England, we tend to divide the population at quite a young age into either STEM or narrative subjects. So STEM and not STEM. But actually, according to Carl Jung, people mature and learn to use the other part of their brain. So people who start out as preferring narrative and empathy and those kinds of things may not really appreciate the logical subjects. And people who start out appreciating the logical subjects may not get on so well with the narrative subjects. And then as you get older, you develop the other part of your brain. And so I think what I'd like the young people to contribute is that nobody should feel left out of STEM, that it's an important subject for everybody. I would almost like the tools I've offered you to become an entitlement in all the STEM subjects, that they're taught in a way that is accessible, linked to what they know already, inclusive, valuable, clearly made valuable to them. So the problems that you're working on are of interest to you, and engaging. And if we can have that kind of pedagogy, or if the youngsters can expect that kind of pedagogy, that will have quite a big impulse on the way it's taught and delivered in the specialized subjects. At the moment, I think for colonial reasons, and I'm saying that very carefully, but I really resent that that's been exported from some countries to others. There's that sense that STEM is elitist, and we are losing out on the potential contribution of some very talented people because they think they're not STEM people, whereas actually they could be if their pedagogy was inclusive enough. I hope that answers Hara's question. I'd love to discuss it more with them if it hasn't yet.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that pedagogy is plays very important role in the dynamics and changing also the pace and the face basically of STEM education. We still have 3 minutes. May I ask you one question? I'm very interested in your network, the International Mathematical Research Network. That you have branches in 8 countries. What do they do? What do you do with the network?
It's very early days. The Brazilians, for example, have got some funding, and 2 of them have come over to the UK to study what we do, and they're planning to take it back and import it into Brazil. I've already written 1 article, it's in the reference list, with one of their teachers, and she's the one that's come over for 6 months. In South Africa, there are 6 early careers researchers, they're teacher trainers, and they're applying for funding, and we're supporting them. And they're going to explore using the framework with their trainee teachers and the trainee teachers with the schools. So they've applied for funding in South Africa. In Ireland, we've just launched their branch, and we had a big gathering, and we had a whole day where we shared awareness of the problem. And so those people have all gone off to start doing some action research with the tools, and also to influence their government. In Turkey, there's a group who've developed a 10-session psychoeducation course using the models, and they've just had their first course run through, and they're reporting on that fairly soon, and they're going to run it again because they're really pleased with the results. Does that give you an idea of the sort of thing that's going on?
Yes, very significant works that you do. Do you have one in Indonesia?
Not yet.
Not
We're
yet.
looking for one person to volunteer to be a contact with the group, and then we can provide whatever support is wanted for people to take this further. There's 2 questions maybe.
Yes, we still have 2 questions. I'm fully aware that you have to travel to London. Do you think you can take 2 more questions, or I'm fully aware of your time?
Thank you.
Okay, so do you want to take the questions? The 2 questions?
Yeah.
Okay. The first question the last two questions. One is from Dr. Aram Fatayan. It's about curriculum. The curriculum in Indonesia is always changing, which makes teacher confused about its application. What do you think is the best curriculum? I think, this is very general questions.
I think it's difficult to answer such a general question.
Yeah, very general questions. Yeah.
I'd be happy to talk to Dr. Aram over the email.
Yeah.
But the reality is that if you introduce a new curriculum, then you really need to be providing CPD, continuing professional development, to the teachers to help them understand the historic roots of the topic and why it's important, and the current applications, so that you don't leave the teachers stranded with a new curriculum. I think politicians tend to rush these things, and I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. The last question is from Pak Krishna. Thank you for the valuable insight from your presentation. I wonder if we want to promote math teachers' awareness regarding math anxiety. Since teachers are mostly focusing on math content and pedagogic aspects rather than psychological aspect of students. On the other hand, educational psychologists or counselors do not specifically focus on math subject to work on. So how to start the efforts?
Okay, well, you can see that I'm trying to make a start. He's absolutely right. That's a good, typical divide. So the maths teachers think it's the psychologist's problem, and the psychologists think it's the maths teacher's problem. In reality, we need a bridge between the psychologists and the educators. And part of what we're doing with the Maths Resilience Network is including psychologists. And there are psychologists working with us in Ireland, in Turkey, in Brazil, for the most extreme cases. But in reality, all of us, I think, have a safeguarding role as educators. And I think all of us have to know enough to keep our students psychologically safe in mathematics learning. And if we don't adopt tools like this, and we're making the harm worse, I think we would be very upset with ourselves. So I'm offering tools that teachers can use to start the effort. And I think you'll find, if you try, that these tools will begin the conversations like the teachers that we've just illustrated in the talk. So thank you for the question. It's a good question.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sue, for your inspiring speech, a topic that is very close to us as educators, students, and parents. Your speech addressed the gap in our understanding of math anxiety and the challenges we face to change our mindset about math education. And I'm sure that we all take away something meaningful to us to reflect and take action from your presentation. We would like to actually deliver a certificate of appreciation virtually. Thank you so much for your time. I'm aware that you have to travel soon to London to present in another conference or seminar or workshop. Have a nice trip and safe trip to London. Again, on behalf of everyone here, thank you. Round of applause to Associate Professor Sue Johnson-Welder. Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye. Okay. Participant and presenter, that's the end of our session, like the afternoon session. Thank you for joining us for today's conference. I hand you over to the Master of Ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Ibu Izul, as the moderator. It was a very interesting presentation we had on Plenary 2. To appreciate the moderator, we are going to give a certificate for Ibu Izul. Please give a big hand for Ibu Izul.
Thank you.
Now, it's time to have a closing session for day 1. There are some announcements we need to inform you for the second day.
Tomorrow, we will start at 8 a.m. for register. First, we will gather at the main room for opening. Presenters should join by writing the room number and name, for example, 01/Nunung. Then there will be breakdown room for all presenters, which each room has different moderators. If one participant wants to go to other rooms, they should go to the main first and ask permission to the committee to go to the designated room. The rule of presentation will be announced tomorrow.
After the presentation tomorrow, the committee will choose the best 3 presenters among all of you, and there will be award for the best 3. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of day 1 of the 3rd Annual International Conference on Natural and Social Science Education 2023. Thank you very much for your participation. We will see you tomorrow for day 2 of the conference.
Let's close our conference today by saying Hamdalah. Take care and stay safe. See you tomorrow.
Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.